You probably know the basic story of the Titanic, that the largest and grandest ship in the world hit an iceberg on its maiden voyage and sank to the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean in the early morning hours of April 15th, 1912. What you might know less about is the music that was played on the Titanic during her short 4.5 day voyage. And at a time in the early 20th century when there was very little interest in Baroque music, you might be surprised to find out that there was some early music, though very little, in the Titanic band's repertoire. So let's find out about Baroque music on the Titanic. I think the best place to start is with a little bit of background about the musicians that were hired to play on the Titanic. Oh, and by the way, if you're interested in learning more about Baroque music or early music in general, please subscribe to my channel, where I put out new videos every other Tuesday about those topics. So, as was common for large passenger ships of the time, the Titanic had a chamber ensemble of hired professional musicians, which were referred to as the band rather than as an orchestra. 5 was a common number of musicians to be in a ship's band, but the Grand Titanic had 8 musicians, all of whom had been contracted through the Liverpool agency of brothers Charles William and Frederick Nixon Black, who were also the sole agents for finding musicians for 6 major shipping lines, including the White Star Line, of which the Titanic was a part. The 8 musicians hired to play on the Titanic consisted of 3 violinists, Wallace Hartley, who was the bandmaster, John Jacques Law Hume, and Georges Crine, 2 cellists, Roger Bricout, and John Wesley Wes Woodward, a bass player, John Frederick Fred Clark, and 2 pianists, William Theodore Theo Brayley and Percy Taylor. They entered the ship as passengers in the second class and were not considered part of the crew, which was part of their contract with the Black brothers. The 8 musicians never played all together while on the ship, however, except possibly during the sinking itself, but were instead split up into 2 separate ensembles, a trio made up of violinist Crine, cellist Bricout, and a pianist, possibly Brayley, that usually played outside the first-class a la carte restaurant or at the Café Parisien. And then there was a quintet made up of the other 5 musicians, led by Wallace Hartley, who most generally played in the first-class lounge or the first-class reception room, where there was a beautiful Model B Steinway grand piano, probably very like this grand piano that was on the first-class reception room in Titanic's sister ship, the Olympic. Note how the piano was bolted to the floor to keep it from moving while at sea. The quintet also played in various other locations around the first and second-class portions of the ship. The musicians were expected to be able to play all of the pieces listed in the White Star Line music book, which was actually a booklet given out to all the first-class passengers. Now, I'm not sure if the musicians on the Titanic played from memory or if they played from music. There is, however, very clearly music stands that you can see in the first-class reception room on the Olympic, and the setup on the Titanic was probably nearly identical. And so that's an indication that they would have played at least some things, if not all things, from music. The White Star Line music book contained about 350 different selections of music, which the passengers could request. And this is where we find the few pieces of Baroque music that might have been played on board. Number 214 is listed as a Largo by Handel, which was actually the aria Ombra mai fu from the opera Xerxes, which was sometimes referred to as the Largo from Xerxes. And the number 152 is listed as Selections from Messiah by Handel, though it doesn't give specifics about what selections. It's unclear whether or not the band ever actually played these selections and pieces by Handel. There are no passengers that I know of that specifically spoke of them having been played. But it's very possible, since the band played a lot of music while on the Titanic. They had 3 separate performance-type setups, one before lunch, one in the afternoon, and one after dinner, as well as frequently playing incidental music and music for special occasions. It should also be noted that these pieces would have, of course, been played in arrangements instead of with their original instrumentation, probably for the quintet of 2 violins, cello, bass, and piano, instead of the trio, which may have had its own separate repertoire. There were no professional singers on board Titanic, and so these would have all been purely instrumental arrangements. And they also would have been highly romanticized, as was the practice in the time, and would have sounded more like this. Instead of how they would have sounded when Handel wrote them, or how we might approach them today, more like this. So why was the only Baroque music possibly played on the Titanic written by George Friedrich Handel instead of some other Baroque composer, like Bach, for example? Well, it has to do with what happened to Handel's music after the composer's death, as well as the story of how Handel's vocal music, particularly his oratorio Messiah, remained popular throughout the 19th century when almost no other Baroque music did. As I've mentioned already in my video on Johann Sebastian Bach, which you can check out if you haven't seen it already, in the 18th century, and really throughout the majority of the history of Western music, music that was in fashion was music that was newly composed. Sometimes, even music that was only about 10 years old was considered completely passé. And so that music was left behind and not rediscovered until generally in the 20th century. But this wasn't the case for Handel's music. His music didn't fade into obscurity, but instead had a continuous performing tradition up until today. This sort of approach to only being interested in new music, newly composed music, is really quite strikingly different from how we generally approach and consume classical music today, and have for most of the 20th and 21st centuries. But Handel's music didn't go this path. It didn't fall into obscurity to be rediscovered later. On the contrary, after the first performances of Messiah in Dublin in 1742, the piece kept being played, especially in London, which is where Handel had made his home as a composer, and then it started to spread out into the continent, being performed in Italy and in Germany in the decades that followed. In 1784, which was thought at the time to be the 100th anniversary of Handel's birth, although we now know that his birth was 1 year later in 1685, there was a giant Handel commemoration celebration, most of which was held in Westminster Abbey. There were 5 performances that happened over several days, all of Handel's music, and one of those performances was Messiah. This event really helped to popularize Handel's music even more than it had been before, especially in continental Europe. And in the 19th century, amateur choral ensembles started to become really all the rage, and in England they quickly took up Messiah into their repertoire, as well as some of Handel's other works. A really gigantic and grandiose Handel celebration was planned for the 100th anniversary of Handel's death, which that celebration took place in 1859, and it was held at the Crystal Palace with more than 2,700 singers and 460 instrumentalists participating. One of the concerts they did was Messiah, and that event helped to create a recurring Handel festival at the Crystal Palace, which is where the 1859 event was held. That festival, the Crystal Palace Handel Festivals, were held continuously into the early 20th century, into the 1920s, and so Handel's music really was heard all the way throughout the 19th century and into the early 20th century at a time when other Baroque music was really not being played. No other Baroque composer received the kind of continuous attention that Handel did throughout the 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries. And so it's really no surprise that he is the composer whose music showed up in the repertoire of the Titanic's band. The selections from Messiah and the Largo from Xerxes would have been pieces that were familiar to the elite passengers on the Titanic. And that, after all, was really the purpose of the music that the Titanic's band played. They were supposed to be familiar tunes that the elite clientele on the ship were interested in listening to. So, there you have it. A little bit more about the Baroque music that might have been played on the Titanic. If you like this video, please subscribe to my channel and hit that little notification bell so that you get notified every time I put out a new video. And if you found this video useful or helpful, please give it a like and leave me a comment below with any questions or comments that you might have. Thank you so much for watching.